Alright, dudes, I've been getting way too political lately. I've been sitting out in this garden. I've been thinking, I want to get back into more wholesome stuff. I was listening to some lady talk about astrology, and I realized, you know what? I've done a good spiritualism video. I don't want to definitely make my channel all about astrology. There are people who do it a lot better than I do, but for people who think, what's this guy talking about? Astrology? Is this guy crazy? No, I'm not. I'm incredibly well-read and logical. I'm a scientist. I like math. Bear with me if you want, or just pass it on. You know what? If this isn't your video, this isn't your video. I'll talk about history. I'll talk about politics. If you like my other stuff, that's fine. You don't have to listen to me talk about astrology. But I would like to say, just to defend my case here real quick before you tune out, I have read a few books on it, a fair number, I want to say about 6 or so. One of them being, like this thick, 50 pages, really dense, like someone's basically masterwork, life work thesis thing about how this stuff kind of, not necessarily how it works, but that it does. That was specifically a whole bunch of historical evidence indicating that there is a lot of trends. Like, I'm personally a scientist, like I said, and I was sort of skeptical about this sort of stuff because it was like, this guy wrote his books during the conjunctions, that gal wrote her books during the conjunctions, that sort of thing, right? And I'm like, well, you could just cherry pick the person's best books and the best word or whatever. Who's just like, yeah, he kept saying like The Origin of the Species and all these really big books and things that I recognize, Frankenstein, like the big names, no doubt. But it's like, how do I know the ones you're not picking aren't just as equally spread out and you're just picking the ones you are, right? And then he got to the history of chemistry. And he read out to me the entire history of chemistry every 7 years on a conjunction with Uranus and, Jupiter? I want to say it was Jupiter. There's some conjunction there that is literally our entire history of science, basically. It's madness. I don't understand how it can be that consistently every 7 years we discover more chemistry. But that was when I really started to go like, there's something to this. And I read that whole 500-page super dense book. It took me about 8 months. I was reading plenty of other books while I was reading it too because it was really dense, and no way I was going to read that thing straight through. Holy cow. I mean, I'm kind of skeptical. I mean, I'm less skeptical than I was, but I was very skeptical back then. But I was like, my friend said, I felt compelled to get you this book from a bookstore. I'm not sure why. And, generally when the universe gives you a book, you go like, okay, there must be a reason. And I was like, this is a weird book to, why'd you think that? I didn't say this, but I was thinking in my head like, this is a weird book to give me. Super strange. But I started reading it, and I realized that's a very important reason I got that book, because it's the only thing that would have convinced me. Literally the only book maybe not the only book in the universe, but only a book like that could have convinced someone like me that there's more to this than I initially gave it credit for. I'm not trying to say that you can predict your entire life or should revolve your life around the way the planets revolve, but there are some sort of higher cosmic waves that do seem to create society-wide trends. And it's pretty compelling. When you get right down to it, it's I decided to do my own experiment. I looked up the history of South America according to some person's website, just a timeline, right? I just needed a timeline. That's what I wanted. Just give me a timeline of South American history. So unless this dude's timeline, unless he intentionally designed it around trying to work with my astrology hypothesis, I mean, which it's just a random timeline on Google, that seems unlikely, right? I looked it up, and like clockwork, every single time that those conjunctions that should have caused revolutions and wars, there were revolutions and wars. Those were the times when they all happened, when people were assassinated, when and I mean, you could say what you will about big bad people who just believe in this stuff, doing stuff behind the scenes and making our history just happen to follow those patterns. They're the people writing the books, etc. But if that's the case, that's a heck of a conspiracy, bud. Even for me. I think it's sort of a bit of both. Maybe some people are aware and they plan their lives around it in order to try to take advantage of when the energies are good. I mean, that seems to be what most people I know who do astrology do. But it seems not everybody could have been reading this stuff. Some of these dudes were, random independent revolutionaries or whatever, right? Like, but, the thing that struck me was once I was dipping my toes in 300 pages into this book or so, and I started to come to terms with the fact that maybe this thing could be real, the next question immediately goes, why? How is it entirely at all possible that planets moving around our solar system so far away that they're not affecting our gravity could be affecting our reality and brains and whatnot. And I came up with 2 hypotheses for why this might be the way that it is, assuming that it is the way that I believe it to be. Yeah. So, option 1 is, if you want to, bear with me, take out a piece of paper and a pencil, or imagine taking out a piece of paper and a pencil, and draw yourself a circle, 360 degrees, mark it out 360 degrees, right? Now, our solar system isn't quite flat, but for the intents and purposes of this mental visualization experiment, it's going to be easier if you just imagine it sort of flat, because that's kind of how I imagine astrology. Like, yeah, we're spinning around through this thing, so it does depend on like what part of the Earth you're going to be hit by what cosmic waves, but like, we're a ball spinning, right? So you're talking about, in a day, we move a lot. So I kind of picture it in terms of like what's on our sort of planetary horizon, because we're talking about, you know, in the case of this book, we're talking about society-wide trends. So we're not talking about, you know, your birth chart or whatever. I'm not getting into that stuff. I think that stuff is a little beyond my depth, for one thing, and less reliable, both from what I've read and from my own intuition. But I do think there's something to that, too, for sure. I do think that there have been a lot of great people who have written their magnum opuses at particular ages that line up with alignments in their birth charts. That's entirely plausible, but I'm not going to pontificate on that too much. But bottom line, if you can imagine, you know, if we're trying to figure out a society planet-wide trend, you're not really caring about what part of the planet you're on too much, right? So we're looking at sort of where we are, and on the horizon, like where all the planets are, right? And that's your 360 degree ring, and you can draw dots and say these planets are here, these planets are there, and make up some charts if you want, or you can look up some charts to get familiar with it if you're not already. But basically, when 2 things are either 1/6 apart, 1/3 apart, 1/4 apart, or halfway apart from each other, across, that is, from each other, or they line up with each other, are eclipsing each other, then you get effects. They're called conjunctions when that happens, and you get some sort of a noticeable effect depending on the planets that are conjuncting each other. It will be either like a Mars-Jupiter effect would have the Mars energy plus the Jupiter ascendant's energy, etc. But why that could work, I've got 2 hypotheses. One, it's just groupthink. There is a greater mind out there that we can all connect to each other with. That's why scientists have, you know, invented the same thing on opposite sides of the planet simultaneously. That's why you can teach a group of monkeys on one island to wash coconuts, and you'll find monkeys on another island that weren't washing coconuts before washing their coconuts, even though those islands are hundreds of miles apart, but it's the same species of monkey, so it's the species mind, maybe. In fact, I think you can communicate with trees and other things of the non-species, too, if you work hard enough at it, maybe. Based on what I've read, not personal experience. Minor personal experience with a tree, but it's not reliable enough to really speak too much on, and I'm going to sound crazy if I do. So, if I don't already, which I'm sure plenty of you are really enjoying laughing at me sort of backpedal and stick my own foot in my mouth. But, back to my weeding. So one option is it's all groupthink. This astrology thing is because, you know, thousands of years ago someone came up with this idea of there's these celestial things in the skies, chariots, Hermes, whatever you want to call them, and they do their thing and they have this effect. And if you believe it, it becomes stronger because we're group thinking and we're all believing into it, and subconsciously, you know, part of our greater clock is like, okay, well, now this thing's coming in conjunction with that, and so therefore it's going to affect me, right? It could be that. Option 2 is that it is just based on physics. When 2 planets are either lined up with each other, opposite each other, 1/3 of the way from each other, or 1/6 of the way from each other, or 1/4 of the way from each other, right? Those are the places where, if you were to make sort of a sine wave that goes around all 360 degrees, it could come back to where it started and interfere constructively rather than destructively. If you're, I suppose you could do a 7th and you could do a 5th as well. But those are the big ones, right? Because if you have, let's say you have a sine wave that every quarter of your planet gets back to maximum, right? So you start here, you've got 2 planets lined up, they're both at maximum, right? You've got a planet here, maximum. Planet here, maximum. Planet here, maximum. Planet here, maximum. You're back to here, your wave is still hitting max. on every single one of these planets. So every single one of these planets' waves is going to build into each other and make a constructive combined effect. Same with the thirds and sixths. They can do, if you imagine a wave that every 1/3 of the planet or every 1/6 of the planet creates a maximal, it's the same kind of deal. Like I said, you could also do fifths, but they wouldn't add up with either of the other ones. So, and maybe sevenths as well. But if you try to do any other number, you wouldn't divide it out to be a whole, amount. Or it would divide into one of these realistically, because it's a factor of 3 or 2, or 5 or 7, prime numbers and all that. But that's my hypothesis for how this stuff works, if it does work. Now, as for how it works sort of on a spiritual, being born kind of level, I think that it could be sort of a way of the universe sort of accounting for what kind of person you're going to become. Like if you, just as a way of rolling the dice, just like in D&D where you build a character, right? Like it's sort of like, your location, that's the people getting it together, right? And then maybe there's this sort of spirit component where a spirit's looking for a body and it finds one, and then or that spirit comes from a combination of these different planetary energies that all come together to make one jumbled up person. And that's why you'll find people where you're like, I feel like we're the similar people. We have this part that is the same, but I also see this part that's really similar to my friend over there. Like if you really pay attention to people, you'll notice there's like some like almost blueprinty patterns that repeat themselves. And maybe that's just because we all repeat the same experiences, and thus there's only a finite number of different kinds of people you can get. But if you really listen here, you can feel it. Sometimes you meet someone who is like, you are like the same person, but you started in a different locality. Cool. It's nice to see what happens when that person lives there. That's cool. I like what you're doing with the lifespan, friend. Nice. Good to re-see you or whatever. Like, it's kind of eerie, but like really, it if you think about it in terms of like, there's 8 billion of us, right? You don't have time to make every single one a beautiful snowflake. It's got to be in some way. There's got to be some way to just sort of do like the automatic character creation and then you're born thing, right? What if it's just as simple as when you're conceived, when the soul comes in, or either one, when you're born or when you're conceived? It might have to do with conception and we're winding the clock back, or it might have to do with how long it takes for those energies to get to Earth, or but they always do astrology charts based on birth chart, so I would assume maybe it's when you first come into the light and are exposed to imprinted with all those things. Who knows? I'm not gonna pertain to know things I don't. I just am pondering on things that I've come across. So if you've got some ideas for how this stuff might work, or how it relates to other energetic stuff up in here, or any other questions, any other content you want me to go over, feel free to post it. Thanks for gabbing. Aloha America, and I'll see you next time.